Ahead of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's two-day visit to Russia on Monday, Kremlin has called it significant for the relations between the two countries. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia is expecting a very important and full-fledged visit by the Indian Prime Minister, which is crucial for Russian-Indian ties. In an interview with Russia's state-run television channel, he said Russian-Indian relations are at the level of strategic partnership. Prime Minister Modi is visiting Moscow on the invitation of Russian President Vladimir Putin for the 22nd annual summit. Narendra Modi is scheduled to reach Moscow late afternoon on the 8th of July. President Putin will host a private dinner for the Prime Minister on the day of his arrival. On the 9th of July, Prime Minister Modi's engagements will include an interaction with the Indian community in Russia. The Prime Minister will also lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Kremlin, following which he will visit the exhibition venue in Moscow. Dmitry Peskov said the agenda of Prime Minister Modi's visit will be extensive. He will hold both one-on-one and delegation-level talks in the Kremlin. India's Ministry of External Affairs said in their meeting, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin will review the entire range of ties between the two countries and exchange views on regional and global issues of mutual interest. The annual summit between Indian Prime Minister and Russian President is the highest institutional dialogue mechanism in the strategic partnership between the two countries. The last annual summit was held in 2021 in New Delhi, when President Putin had visited India. This will be Prime Minister Modi's first visit to Russia in nearly 5 years. His last visit to Russia was in 2019 when he attended an economic conclave in the Far East city of Vladivostok. And for more on this, we are being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibil, who is joining us live from Moscow. Siddhant, give us a sense of the mood on ground ahead of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia, and how excited is the Indian diaspora to meet Prime Minister Modi? How are the weather conditions looking like as well?
Well, essentially talking about the Indian diaspora, I just spoke to several members of the Indian diaspora about how excited they, of course, are when it comes to meeting the Indian Prime Minister. Of course, that remains one of the key elements of Prime Minister's program here in Moscow. And we have seen whenever Prime Minister travels abroad, this has been a key crucial element meeting the Indian diaspora. Now, when it comes to the Indian diaspora, they have been here since centuries, but in last 3 or 4 decades, we know that has been a recent history or past of Indian diaspora. And when the diaspora spoke to WION, they talked about how they, of course, also culturally celebrate their Indianness here in Russia. But that apart, we know that this is a significant visit, which is many firsts, including the first visit of the Prime Minister since the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the first visit of the Prime Minister, the bilateral visit of Prime Minister in his third term, and the first visit after a gap of almost 5 years. He last traveled to Russia was in 2019. But essentially, this is a visit for the 22nd India-Russia summit, where every issue will be on the table, whether it is defense, security, connectivity, or issues like, of course, the increasing trade deficit that has been concerned for New Delhi, or the Indians in the Russian army. That has been something that India has strongly raised with the Russian side, including last week when the Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Astana. So essentially, whether it is issues where there is strong convergences or issues where there are divergences, all these issues will be discussed. And remember, this is a summit happening after a gap of 3 years. The last India-Russia summit happened in 2021 when the Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to New Delhi.
Siddhant, the last time the two leaders met, Prime Minister Modi said that it was time for peace and not war. Amid the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what advice do you think that Prime Minister Modi will give Putin this time around, and can we see any outcome of this as well?
Well, it's given that when it comes to ongoing Ukraine conflict, that will be part and parcel of the conversation. And the Samarkand comments that this is not an era of war reverberated, including in the G20 joint statement, the G20 joint statement of Indonesia, which was the president that year. Thereafter, of course, the New Delhi joint statement as well when it comes to the Indian presidency of the G20. But India has made it clear that dialogue and diplomacy are only way forward. And India has taken a neutral approach. We know that India has abstained at many resolutions when it comes to the UNSC and the United Nations General Assembly when it comes to Russia-Ukraine conflict, and of course has been trying to engage both sides when it comes to this conflict. Recently we saw the Swiss Peace Summit where India was present, India participated, but India was not part of the joint statement. So carefully nuanced balancing both towards Moscow and the West is something that has been the long-standing Indian position. But what will be the different thing that the Indian Prime Minister will be talking about this conflict is something that will be closely watched. And of course, remember this visit coming to Moscow at a time when in Washington we will see the NATO summit as well. So eyes will be both on Moscow and Washington, the Prime Minister's visit and the NATO summit next week.
Siddhant, both India and Russia have maintained strong ties since the Cold War, and despite Western sanctions against the Kremlin, India has continued to buy Russian oil. Can Putin rely on India to boost Russia's post-war economy?
Well, recently the World Bank said that Russia is in the high income group country, and you know why that has happened. That has primarily happened because of the Russian diversification of its exports to Asia, particularly countries like China and India. And while India has maintained a neutral stance when it comes to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, India has continued to buy the Russian crude oil, and that of course despite the Western pressure. So essentially Putin knows that India is needed, and despite the attempts by the West to isolate Russia, it is countries like India and China which the Russians have been banking on. And the fact that the Prime Minister of India is traveling to Russia in his first bilateral visit in his third term is a message in itself, and this is something that of course the Russians will be closely noticing. I'm standing just near the Kremlin, and this is the place where we know that on 9th, that is on Tuesday, the Indian and the Russian leaders will be meeting and talking about several issues, and of course how they have continued to engage with each other, whatever has happened. And as the Indian External Affairs Minister said, that this is a relation that has been constant throughout last 70 years, whether it's the rise of China, whether it is India's good relationship with US, but India-Russia relationship have been seen as stabilizing factor in the world.
Thank you, Siddhant, for joining us on the broadcast to continue tracking all these developments for us. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.